We scramble to get it ready. Good evening and welcome, everybody, to the Field Service Live channel. I'm James Leichter, your host. We do this every Thursday night, 7 p.m. Technical troubles or not, we get it going. Every Thursday night, 7 p.m., we try to help field service contracting companies improve their lives, improve their businesses. You know, we all define success in different ways. Some of it is, some people say, well, I want to be more profitable, or I want to spend more time fishing, or spend more time with my family. We try to help you be more successful, however you define that. Your questions and comments are certainly welcome and appreciated. The more questions, the better. I love getting questions from people. I don't like scripted things. I don't like following a pattern or a framework entirely. I like it when I get questions from people and we go in different directions. It's a whole lot funner for me. So please feel free to ask questions. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about inventory control part 2. That's important. Why? Because without inventory control, inventory tracking, inventory management, they all mean the same thing in my mind. Without managing your inventory, without tracking your items going in and out, you don't have good financial reports. You don't have good job costing reports. Your income statement, balance sheet, job costing reports are all going to be wrong. They'll be as wrong as your inventory is wrong. So if you have $100,000 in inventory, but on your balance sheet you show $50,000, then your reports are $50,000 off, basically. So it's important to have inventory control if you want to have good financials. Now, why would you want good financials? Some of you might say, hey, we don't really need financial statements. I've ran this company successfully without financials for a long time. That might be. I'd like to suggest, though, that you could even do better if you had financials. You might be able to also tell me that you're a very good HVAC technician and that you have been working on HVAC equipment for a lot of years successfully without a set of gauges, without thermometers, without proper tools. And I'd say to you, well, if you've done a good job without proper tools, I would suggest maybe you could do better with proper tools. It's the same way with running your company without financials. It's like running service calls without a set of gauges or an accurate thermometer or an accurate multimeter. You just don't want to guess at those things, right? So inventory control is really important for that reason. But also, there's other reasons too. It makes your company far more efficient. When you have the right parts, it's easier to do a great job running service calls. It's also easier to sell things when you have those things on hand. When you have the correct parts and equipment and things like that, it's easier to sell those things. But also, it's way easier to do a good job running service calls. Before we went on air tonight, my son came by. My son is Jordan. One of my sons is Jordan. And Jordan's kind of famous for his weird facts of the day. You know, he says, hey, have you heard? Hey, Dad, have you heard that? And so tonight he told me how to become a millionaire easily for about $1 a day. For just over $1 a day, he told me how to become a millionaire. And I'm going to roll up my sleeves here, and because I can't stand sleeves. I can tell the story without sleeves, but I don't like these sleeves down. All right. So now I'm more comfortable. So I'm going to tell you the story as my son told it to me tonight. Hey, Dad, did you know you could save $1 million easily for like $1 a day? How can you do that, Jordan? Well, he says, okay, now picture yourself. You're 18 years old, and you put away $365 at the beginning of every year. Not even $1 a day, but just do it annually. $365, you deposit that in your bank account every year until you retire 47 years later at 65. So it's $1 a day from the time you're 18. Maybe you're washing dishes, you can afford $1 a day, right? No matter what your job is, you can afford $1 a day. So when you're 18, you put $1 a day away. And when you retire at 65, you could nearly be a millionaire. Let me tell you how we came up with that. So imagine you put away $365 a year, $1 a day, and you put it into the S&P 500. Now, you're going to retire 47 years later. If you're 18, 47 years later, you're 65. If you look at the S&P 500 for the past 47 years, it is averaged, and I looked it up just before I came in here, it is averaged 12.32% as of tonight, 12.32%, the last 47 years. If you think that it'll do the same in the next 47 years, probably a pretty decent assumption, and you put away $1 a day, 18 years old, retire at 65, you'll have $779,422. So if you would just double that to $2 a day, you'll have over $1.5 million. If you made those weekly deposits, $1 a day per week, you'd have just under $1 million. But just to make the math easy, $365 a year from 18 to 65 invested in the S&P 500, and you will have just under $780,000. Double that, you've got over $1.5 million in savings. So anybody can be a millionaire. $1 a day can make you a millionaire. $1.50, call it. $1.50 for sure can make you a millionaire. So that's how you become a millionaire, at about $1 a day. All right, let's get back down to the ground here and talk about inventory. We spoke about inventory in our last show 2 weeks ago, and I had a lot of email, a lot of good questions, and I'm like, hey, man, why don't you ask these questions on air? So we have some people show up for the show asking questions. Why are you sending me emails with all these questions? But I said I would address these anyway, but I was hoping they'd come on and ask them live. Some of the questions were around item numbers. I talked about creating your own item numbers, and if you want to go back and watch that video, please do. But we spoke about the importance of creating our own part numbers for things and not using part numbers supplied by the vendor. The reason why we don't want to use the vendor's part number is that they usually don't make sense. If they do make sense, then you might keep them. But they usually don't make sense. So you might buy a contactor and the part number is like XYZ 462 or something. And a motor could be 3472456, which wouldn't make any sense. Also, you might buy the same contactor, relay, motor, capacitor from multiple places, multiple suppliers, all of which use a different part number. And that messes up our inventory. It makes inventory a lot more difficult to manage because we might have 10 contactors in stock, but it looks like we have 6 different part numbers, 6 different things, when all the contactors were basically the same. So let's say that you buy a contactor and you need a part number for it. Let's go with CTR for contactors. So whenever you see a CTR, you know it's contactor. And we have a 4-pole contactor, so it might be CTR 4. Maybe this is a 24-volt control. So the control voltage is 24 volts, and it's for 208, 230. So you might say CTR 4, 230. And 24 for the control voltage. Now, actually, the 230, I wouldn't really care to do that. I'd probably just use amperage. So let me correct myself. I'll say CTR 4, 30, 24. So CTR 430, 24. That's a contactor, 4-pole, or 2-pole. Sorry. I'm thinking industrial there. CTR 2, 30, 24. So that's a contactor, 2-pole. 30 amp, 24 volt control. What if we have a motor, MTR? So motors all start with MTR. Everybody will know what they are. It could be an inducer, blower motor, any kind of motor, MTR. And we'll start by identifying the motor's voltage, or horsepower rather. So we might say 040, MTR 050 for half a horse. And now the voltage, 230, and maybe that's a D for direct drive. So we have MTR 050230D. That is a motor, half horse, 230 volt, D for direct drive. You could also add to that the frame number if you wanted to, or other information that you found handy. But regardless of who makes the motor and other minor differences, you would use that part number for all your condensing unit fan motors that are half horse, 230 volt direct drive. And that way you can buy these motors from different places and they'll all use the same part number. Now, one thing that's really helpful is if you have software that can help you manage a part number alias, the vendor's part number. You would be able to assign contactors, motors, and everything else your own part number, but the software would also keep track of the vendor's part number and cross-reference the two. Now, that depends on what software you're using. QuickBooks can't handle that. That's one of the reasons why people leave QuickBooks and they go with software that was really built for the industry, like Total Office Manager from Aptora does that. QuickBooks doesn't. Microsoft has accounting software that does that, and there are other large enterprise-level accounting programs that have that feature. So they, in other words, they let you use your own part number, but you're able to enter multiple part number aliases, and they all flow into the same part number. Now, a part number like MTR 050230D is pretty easy for even a novice to figure out quickly. They know it's a motor with just a moment of training, and pretty soon they start realizing what the 050 means and the 230 means. But you can extend this to many other items. Let's say we have an EMT connector. So that way, if you're an electrician, I'm covering you too. I guess HVAC, electrician, refrigeration, you're going to encounter EMT connectors. So an EMT connector is going to start out with what? EMT. And what kind of EMT connectors do we have? Well, we've got straight, 90, etc. Let's just say that we start out with the dimension, and it'll be 050. So that's a half-inch EMT connector. And then we can do ST for straight. So EMT 050 ST is an EMT connector, half-inch straight. And it just goes on and on. I mean, you just keep doing it like this. No matter what it is, gas valves, black pipe fittings. You want to start with 3 or 4 letters to designate what it is, and then start with the most important information working from left to right. So usually it's horsepower, dimensions, length, whatever's the most important. So the beginning of the part number is a few letters, and then you identify the most important things about that part as you number it from left to right. That would allow you, again, to buy what is essentially the same thing from lots of different vendors, and they can all share the same part number. That makes inventory control way easier. If you think about it, inventory management can be really difficult because you might only carry a couple of hundred things, but you could have 800 things to manage in your software because of all the different part numbers all the different vendors are using. So one of the tricks that really good inventory control companies have is this whole item part number convention that we've talked about. And they use the item alias, as it's usually called, to keep track of the vendor's own part number. But they have their own part number for everything. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. I'll give you one more example because it's real common. Let's say a capacitor. To go along with that motor, we need a capacitor. So this motor uses a 5 microfarad capacitor. So what's the part number for a capacitor? As I mentioned, the first few letters indicate the most important thing, and that is it's a capacitor. It's a cap. So let's just say CAP. Most of us call them caps anyway. Hey, let me have that cap over there, right? So we'll just call it a cap, CAP. And then we start with its maximum voltage, which would be we'll say 370. So now we have a part number of cap 370. And maybe this is a 5 microfarad capacitor. And because we might be dealing with 2 digits, we should always have a leading 0. So it's going to be 05. So we have cap 37005. Everybody would know what that part number was really quick. Technicians would know what it meant instantly. They could guess. But even novices would quickly understand what that part number meant. And then when you buy that capacitor from 8 different places, they all share the same part number. So that's important. One last thing about that, makes it a whole lot easier to get your technicians to go find those part numbers and write those down on your invoice or work orders. If you're using an app, then it's a whole lot easier to go search for caps. You type in CAP, it narrows it down to capacitors, right? And then you type in 37, don't even put in the 0, and you're already there. So imagine how easy it is to go find the motor, go find the capacitor, and get that put on your work order or your invoice. It is essential that you get your technicians to cooperate with you when it comes to adding part numbers to work orders and invoices on their paperwork or in the app. Hopefully you're using an app, but paperwork's fine. But it's critical to get the technicians to cooperate with you and write these part numbers down. Otherwise, you're not going to know what they sold, and it's going to be difficult to replenish their truck. All right, something else that came up after our show 2 weeks ago was the various ways to order inventory. Or as one person asked, what prompts ordering inventory? When do we order inventory? Who does it? So let's talk about the 3 main reasons why we order inventory. Now, first I should define inventory for a minute. For the purposes of our discussion, inventory is just referring to all the things that you're buying. It could be items that you keep in inventory, and it could be items that you don't have in inventory. Okay? It could be parts, equipment, etc. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily stock it. When we say inventory, we're not necessarily talking about whether or not you stock the item on a shelf, whether you track it or not. So inventory is just all the stuff, if you will, all the stuff that you're buying. Now, there's usually 3 situations that cause you to order inventory, and you should always use a purchase order, by the way. You're ordering to fill or replenish your warehouse. You are ordering for jobs that you have going on. You have jobs you've sold, and your special ordering parts. So when it comes to ordering for your warehouse, you're ordering all the items that you have decided you are going to keep in your warehouse. You're going to keep them in stock. You may not track all of these, but these are the things that you want to have on hand. So that's that contactor, motor, capacitor, but it could also be a jar of pipe dope, a roll of Teflon tape, duct tape, screws, adhesives, things like that. Those would be supplies. Those latter things, by the way, would be supplies that we generally wouldn't count. We put them on the shelf, but they're not stocked. In other words, we're not tracking how many we have on hand. So you order to fill that warehouse. That warehouse is what fills your trucks. So you typically don't order to stock your trucks, per se. You stock your trucks from the main warehouse, and you replenish the main warehouse. So the first reason we order is to fill the warehouse or replenish the warehouse. Number 2, order for jobs. A job gets sold. Hopefully an estimate's created. Purchase orders are created from that itemized estimate, and you order those things and bring them in to your warehouse. They could go straight to the job, by the way. So we're ordering for jobs. And the third way, again, as I mentioned, special order parts. You have a service technician out in the field. They need a circuit board that's not in stock, that's not on their truck. And they contact the warehouse manager and say, I need an XYZ circuit board. What do you want me to do? And that's what they should do, by the way. They should not just be allowed to make that decision for themselves. They should call the warehouse manager or a service manager, if it's more appropriate in your company. It just depends on how your company's structured, but they need to call someone and say, what do you want me to do? And then the manager can say, I want you to drop by the office. We have one of those here. I'm going to give it to you. It's on my van. I'll give it to you. Or I'm going to go order that for you and you can go pick it up. It should be waiting. Or maybe the person says, I want you to go on to your next service call. And when you're finished with it, go back to their house and the board will be there waiting for you. Something like that. But we don't want the technician to make up their own mind. So that's special order parts. It's really important that the technician be billing. When I was young, I was told, if you aren't billing, you're chilling. And the point the guy made was, you are like a lawyer. You're nothing unless you're not billing a client. Unless you're billing a client, rather, you're nothing. You're all about billable time. Technician is thinking billable time. That's their focus, billable time. And the office needs to keep them billing. So you want to keep them out of supply houses, keep them out in the field, fixing things, doing what they do best, and billing people for that work. All right, let's talk about that truck stock for a minute. As we mentioned last time around, it's really important to come up with a list of things to have on each truck, and you should consider the industry that you're working in and the type of work that the driver, the technician, the operator of that vehicle does. If they do some commercial refrigeration, you have to accommodate that, but you might have another technician that doesn't do refrigeration or doesn't do commercial work. They just do residential. So you have to think a lot about what goes on that truck. Your goal is that they can run 100 service calls and have parts for 95 of them. 95 out of 100 service calls. 95% of the time, they should be able to pull the parts off their truck and have everything they need. Now, remember, they may make do if they don't have what they need. And that creates callbacks, and at a minimum, it creates lost revenue opportunity for us. So even if they seem to have had everything they needed, it's important to look into that and make sure that sales opportunities weren't missed, because shortcuts will be taken if they don't have the correct things. For example, if they don't have a capacitor mounting kit, what do you think they're going to do? They're not going to go buy one. They're just going to, wire tie the capacitor to something or tape it to something. And there's times where that's okay. It looks okay. Maybe there's an old mount on there that you can use. But I think you see my point. It's best to use a mounting kit, make it look good, make it look nice. Don't take shortcuts. I'm sure you can think of other examples of shortcuts that will be taken if they don't have the correct parts. So 95% of the time, they need to have everything they needed for that call. And that may seem difficult to do, but it's definitely possible and very doable, because I know people that do it. Certainly 9 out of 10 is absolutely doable. Remember, if you're monitoring the things that you're buying, you're going to perfect that list, and each generation of your truck stock list is going to get better and better. As the truck needs to be replenished, as things are sold off the truck, your company is monitoring that sales activity. And your warehouse manager, service manager, whoever's responsible for this, they are pulling those items and they are staging those. They're putting them, say, in a box, a container of some kind. When the technician comes in for some regularly scheduled event, such as training, meetings, things like that, they pick up that box and their truck is then restocked. So every time they come to the office and pick up that box, which should be no more than once a week. You don't want them coming in every day or two. Once a week when they pick up that box, their truck is restocked according to your list. And your list gets better and better with every iteration of it. Then the main warehouse gets restocked. Main warehouse feeds the trucks, and the suppliers feed the main warehouse. So the main warehouse gets restocked so it's ready to stock those trucks. We talked about the jobs. Let's explore that a little further. we order parts for these jobs, and we bring those into the main warehouse. Now, typically, they don't go on the shelves, depending on what kind of space and setup you have. They typically don't go on the shelves. These orders get staged, and they can be staged, say, in the warehouse where you've taped off an area. Maybe you've taped off a 10 by 10 foot square, and in that square you would place the air handler or the furnace, the evaporator coil, the condensing unit, the line set, the pad, etc., all those things inside that square, and each square could be numbered, number 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you tell your installer or install crew that you have a job for them Monday morning, and it is staged at number 2. So they'll come in whenever they are ready. They'll go to that number 2 box, that taped off box on the floor with the number 2 on it, and they know to grab everything. And then when they return unused items, you'll have a place for them to return those unused items. The only thing you have to do is think about what you gave them and subtract what they brought back, and now you have accurate job costing. So the job is sold through an estimate. The estimate is itemized. From the estimate, you would create purchase orders, either through your software or by paper, by hand, if that's what you have to do. The purchase orders everything. It comes in, it gets staged, the installers grab it all, and they bring back what they didn't use. What they didn't use then gets put on the shelves, so it goes into inventory, and or it gets returned to the vendor. So you would return to the vendor things that you just don't want to stock. You just don't want to keep that in stock. Maybe it was a lot of extra pipe or sheet metal or something like that. Return it to the vendor if you can. Otherwise, put it on the shelf. Now, the estimate, remember, we call it an estimate because we're estimating what we need. We call these people estimators, at least that's a little bit old school, but salespeople were called estimators. Certainly that term is still used in commercial industrial work, but they're called estimators. The document's called an estimate. It's the same thing as a proposal, but the estimate is itemized. The proposal might not be, but the estimate is itemized. The estimate contains all the things that you estimated that you were going to need to do the job. If it turns out that you needed more or less of those things, you don't change the estimate because the estimate was your prediction of what was going to happen. So that doesn't get changed unless there's an official change order. What gets modified is the invoice. So when you go to create the invoice, it needs to contain all of the things that were used on the job, not the estimate. Depends on your software. Like if you're using QuickBooks or Total Office Manager, you might create your invoices from an estimate and it brings over all the items on that estimate. That's fine. But you'll take off things that you didn't need on the invoice, and you'll add things to the invoice that you ended up needing that you didn't think you were going to need. And now in both software programs, you'll be able to run a report called estimated versus actual, and you'll be able to see on one column everything that you thought you were going to need, including labor time, everything you thought you were going to need for the job on one column, and everything that you actually needed on the job on the other column, and the difference between the two. And the more detail you have, such as a labor item for pickup and delivery of equipment, a labor item for tear out, a labor item for setting the equipment, a labor item for rough-in, startup, etc. 5, 6 labor items. The more you detail out your estimate, especially the labor, then the easier it will be for you to determine what went wrong. And what went wrong is almost always labor. I mean, you rarely miscount how many air handlers you're going to need, right? You rarely miscount to any significant degree how much duct work you're going to need, things like that. You might have called for X number of pipe or duct work or sheet metal, and you ended up needing more, but it was fairly inconsequential. Really what matters is that labor. That's what really hurt you. So divide out your labor as much as you can, and it makes it easier to analyze the job and find out what went wrong, if anything. So again, they bring back what they didn't need, and that adjustment is not made on the estimate, it's made on the invoice. Okay, so hopefully that helps. That makes sense. Those are some of the questions that I was asked to clarify, and I wanted to get to those today anyway. Let's talk a little bit about the special order parts for the technician. I touched on this earlier. I can't overemphasize how important it is to come up with a very efficient method of finding out what they need and getting it to them as quickly as possible. You will be money ahead if you drive it out to them. If you have somebody that can drive parts out to them, it'll be way cheaper in almost any case that I've looked at anyway. It'd be way cheaper than having them chase down the parts or come to the office and pick up parts. If they did that really fast, it's not so bad, but oftentimes they don't, and time is wasted. So really work hard to find ways to get people what they need as quickly and as efficiently as you possibly can. The installers, it's the same with the installers. If they're working and they're hanging metal or whatever they're doing, it's usually way better for you to bring them what they need. Or if they can do without until the next day, just have them come get it or deliver it that evening or first thing in the morning. But bottom line is keep everybody working, keep the technicians billing people. Again, think of them as a lawyer. They're useless to us unless they are billing for their time. A general rule of thumb, by the way, is a technician should produce about no more than 25% unbillable time. If you pay them for an 8-hour day, they should be billing out 6 hours of that 8. And doing more than that is quite possible. Heck, we keep talking about lawyers, right? I mean, only a lawyer can bill, 10 hours in an 8-hour day, right? If you're flat rating, though, you could do that, right? If you use flat rate pricing and your book called for about 10 hours of work today and you managed to do all that in 7.5, 8 hours, well, then you're way ahead of the game, aren't you? And that's why the automotive industry adopted that a long time ago. They should also be shooting for 700 gross profit dollars, they being your demand service tech. They should be shooting for 700 gross profit dollars per day. That's what they need to produce per person day. So if they work Monday through Friday, then you want them to produce 3,500 gross profit dollars each week. So 700 a day times 5, right? I got that right? 35. And that works out to be 14,000 in 4 weeks, right? These aren't sales numbers. These are gross profit dollar numbers, but that's generally what you need before a service technician is going to be producing a net profit. I've heard other people give numbers of 600 a day, 650. Those are all pretty close. Your company can vary a little bit, but these are good rules of thumb for you to be gauging where you're at and maybe where you should be. Parts pricing. It may not seem like it's part of inventory control, but it definitely is part of inventory management. And I use those terms interchangeably, I know, but if you are a manager in charge of inventory, then you are most likely going to be involved in parts pricing, or you should anyway. You should be involved in that whole subject. In our industry, field service, so that's HVAC, plumbing, electrical, commercial refrigeration, appliance repair, really just about any company that drives a vehicle to a home or a business is field and fixes things and installs things is field service, right? But what I'm talking about are companies that don't sell just parts. They sell parts and labor as part of a whole job. So you're running a service call and you sell a motor and a capacitor and an hour and a half of labor, or you do an installation and you sell 1 or 2 days of labor. You have an air handler, you have maybe a furnace, heat pump, condensing unit, humidifier, labor. All those things together are a system. So in our business, we don't really think in terms of just selling parts to people. The only exception is if you had an over-the-counter sales department where people could walk in and buy things from you, then we would want to price those parts out differently than we would price out parts as part of a service call or an installation. Well, here's what I'm getting at. There really isn't that much overhead in selling parts. Almost all your overhead is the labor that goes into installing those parts. If you buy a part for $10, you've probably heard that you should double, triple, or quadruple the price of that part. Well, that might be important if it's time and materials where you are showing your customer, your labor rate and the price of the part. It's important to divide out the total amount of money that you need to get, divide that out between the parts and the labor so both share part of the burden. In other words, it wouldn't help you to sell the part at cost and have a $350 an hour labor rate because people would say, oh my gosh, your labor rate's ridiculous. And you could tell them, yeah, but I didn't mark up the part. But how would they know? It's not like it's a gallon of milk or a loaf of bread. They don't know what a contactor or an RBM relay or a capacitor costs. So what you do is you charge what seems like a lot for that capacitor, that contactor, but it's not really because you're not charging nearly enough for your labor. When you put the labor and the parts together and come up with a price, it really doesn't matter how much markup went onto the labor or the parts because you're not really marking those two things up separately. You're trying to come up with a retail price that produces a reasonable net profit before taxes. So let's talk about replacing a fan motor. You probably need to charge about $500 to replace that fan motor. And that may seem high to some of you, and some of you might be saying, I charge more than that, but you get the idea. So let's say we need to charge $500 for that fan motor. I wouldn't charge $500, by the way. I'd charge $498 or $497 or something like that, but I'll keep saying $500 because it's easier math. It doesn't matter how much of that came from the motor, how much of that came from the labor. The two things combined have a cost, and you've got to get 750 gross profit dollars a day. So you're going to need to charge $500 in order to reach that goal of 750 gross profit dollars per day. And you're going to have some really good days and some bad days, right? That's an average, and you have to do way better than that on some days because you're going to do way less than that on other days. You're going to need $500 for that motor. So when it comes back to the subject of how to price your items, you have to think about what department you're talking about. If it's demand service, you're really just charging enough for your items to cover your cost of buying it and maybe some shrinkage. Like, for example, you lose some of them break under warranty, but you don't get reimbursed. Also, you have to think about discounts that you might offer, such as a senior citizen discount of 10%. Or maybe you have a service agreement discount. You own a service agreement, then you get a 15% discount. Well, you need to charge enough that when you give that discount, you're not giving it away for less than you paid. So let's say that your cost of that motor is $50. You're going to at least charge $57.50 to cover a 15% service agreement discount. You're probably going to want to add a little bit of that for shrinkage and handling. You could be charging $60, $65 for that motor, and that would be just fine. Because there really isn't a lot of there isn't a lot of overhead on that motor, and believe it or not, you could sell that for $65 and be okay. It's just that the labor is where all your overhead is, and that's where we're going to be charging all that money. When you go to calculate your break even on labor, you want your labor to carry the full burden of your operation. You want your labor to carry all the overhead of the company. And then you add for net profit. I said company, I should have said department. So I'll correct that. I'll say that again. when you're figuring out what to charge for demand service, you're going to be looking at your demand service department's overhead. And you're going to want to make sure that you are marking your labor up high enough to cover all the overhead. You don't want to try to cover overhead on your parts, because you may sell no parts, you may sell a lot of parts, you may sell somewhere in between, but one thing's for sure, you're going to sell labor. You're going to sell labor. Labor always accompanies that part. So your parts aren't really making you any money. The markup on the parts is very minor, just enough to cover the shrinkage, discounts that might be offered. You might mark your parts up 25%, and that's it. But your labor is marked up much, much higher, 6, 7, 8 times what you're paying your technician. That's how we get to that, say, $500 for that motor replacement. So your labor carries the whole burden. Anyway, I started this conversation by saying that we were going to talk about how to price parts. I really am not prepared to give you the formulas and all the math on how to determine the correct price on a part. The point I wanted to make was it's far less important what you charge for your parts than it is what you charge for your labor. Your labor should carry all the overhead for the department that it's in, whatever department it is. And then your parts and your equipment should be marked up a very small amount, maybe the 25% range, just to cover possible discounts, shrinkage, damage, non-reimbursed warranty work, callbacks, etc. It's real important that you price all your parts out if you're time material. It's really important that you price out all of your parts differently. I mean, when you're time material, as I said earlier, I don't want to be mistaken if you came in here late. When you're charging time material, you're marking up your parts way more because you're sharing the required gross profit dollars between labor and parts. If you are time materials, you're going to want to price out all your parts. So when they pick that part up off the shelf in their vehicle, there's a price on it. And you're going to want to make sure that there's a part number on that box as well. So you have to have part numbers and you have to have pricing. If you're flat rate, then you don't have to worry about the price of the item. The item wouldn't have a price on it. Another advantage, no price on the part because you're selling the service and you're using whatever parts you have to use. When it comes to the flat rating, you might be presenting a flat rate task, depending on what your software does or how it manages this. You're probably presenting a flat rate task that is not an item or a group of items. It's a service of some kind. So you might say, I need to replace your fan motor. Your total investment is $497.52. Well, whatever parts you use, you got to make sure that you get them on the invoice, and you'll keep the retail price at $0, and those parts won't be shown to the customer. If you use QuickBooks or Total Office Manager, then there's a setting for that. If there's no retail price, suppress that line item, don't show it. That way they see the flat rate task, but they don't see the items which are essential for job costing and inventory management. They don't see the items on that invoice because the retail price, again, is $0. Now, at first that may seem a little odd, retail price is $0, but remember, I'm not talking about the cost of the item, your cost. The software will know that. If you don't use software, well, then your bookkeepers will know that. Your accountants will know the cost, certainly. But the retail price is $0, so it doesn't affect the price that we've agreed on, the flat rate presentation. The key, again, is if you're time material, you got to mark that part up a lot. You're going to show this pricing. You're going to show the pricing for those items. If you're flat rating, then you're still putting those items on your invoice, but the retail price is $0. You're not showing them to anybody. So hopefully that gives you a few things to think about on parts pricing. I guess one last thing I'll leave you with is, just like a hardware store, the smaller the part, the higher the markup, the higher the gross profit margin, not the gross profit dollars. So you might go to a hardware store and buy a screw for 45 cents. And 45 cents is not a lot of money. But it might be that they have purchased that screw for 5 cents. So 45 divided by 5 is 9, right? So they've marked that up 900%. 900%. Well, that's a lot of markup. I mean, if you told your friend that you were going to sell them a furnace at a 900% markup, they'd probably freak out and think you were very dishonest. Well, you don't mark up your furnaces 900%, but you should be marking up your wire nuts, your screws, and things like that 4, 5, 6, 700% or more. Point I'm making is the smaller the item, the less likely you're going to charge for it, the more likely you're going to lose some of them. They're going to fall and no one's going to pick them up. You have to mark up your little items a lot to make it worthwhile when you're time material. I mean, again, time material, that's where it really matters. If you're flat rating, it's all about the price we charge for the whole service, and we know how much we're going to spend on screws and wire nuts and things like that, and that's figured in, and the final price contains enough gross profit dollars that will be fine. But on time material, you're going to want to mark up the small things much more than the big things. So a $200 circuit board will have less gross profit margin. Remember, that's the percent. It's going to have a lower gross profit margin than, say, a relay or certainly a small piece of hardware, screws, things like that, wire nuts, things like that. So parts pricing, do that for each department: demand service, maintenance, residential replacement, commercial replacement. Usually those should be handled differently. Each department has its own overhead. Hopefully you have departmentalized financials. You can look at the overhead for each one of your department. I should back up and tell you what I meant. When I say departmentalized financials, what I mean is you should be able to go into your software and pick a department, such as residential demand service, and you should be able to hit a button to print your income statement. And right in front of you, you should be able to put your income statement down, and you should see your revenue, sales, cost of goods sold, gross profit, but also all your overhead for that department. All your overhead should be allocated by the software. You should see net profit. Well, now that you know what all that overhead is and you know what the percentage of that overhead is per hour of labor sold, because you can look at all the labor that you sold, it gets pretty easy to start figuring out what you need to charge for labor. So it's really important to have departmentalized income statements so that you can evaluate each of your departments independently, because you'll see they're way different. They have totally different dynamics. You look at those independently when you start determining your pricing. And remember, when you offer a fixed price, call that flat rating or not, it's a fixed price, which we do all the time for service agreements. We do it all the time for replacements. We should do it for demand service. When you offer a fixed price, you're not thinking about markup on parts. So the whole topic of marking up parts is fairly irrelevant. You're just simply marking them up roughly 25% so that you're never selling them less than you paid. And all your profit, your overhead, your net profit is coming from the labor sales. All right, so mark up those little things more than the big things when you're time and material, and that will help you with your profitability. Hey, an unrelated time material tip, and I know I frown on time material. I know you can tell that. I don't like to charge time material. The reason why I don't is because I think that society doesn't think we're worth what we're worth, and if we start quoting them $400 an hour, they're not going to want to pay it. But oftentimes you break even at $360 an hour, and you have to charge $400 an hour. But people are going to say, "Gosh, that's more than you deserve. I don't make $400 an hour." Like, that's a fair comparison, right? I don't make $400 an hour. I'm not going to pay you $400 an hour. That's a ripoff. But you have to charge that. How can you charge $400 an hour? Well, you can't speak in terms of hourly any more than they speak in terms of hourly when they quote you a fee to change your motor oil. You're paying a lot per hour to have your motor oil changed. If you're having somebody change your motor oil, you're paying a lot per hour for that. You just don't realize it because it's presented as a flat rate price. So I know I seem to frown on time material, but I understand it's needed. There are certain commercial situations that you have to charge time material. And I'm okay with time material as long as you're profitable. The problem is we see in my accounting firm and we see in my accounting software company where I make most of my living. I spend most of my time during the day when I'm not down here in my mom and dad's basement broadcasting.
Keep it quiet in there.
Mom, stop it. She's always embarrassing me. I'm moving out. As soon as I save enough money, I'm putting away $1 every day. I'm moving out of here, Mom. I'm gone. But so where was I? Mom interrupted and threw me off. I'm okay with time material as long as you're profitable. That's the key, is you just have to be profitable. And how do you know? Most people that come to us and say, we're just not making as much money as I think we should be. Can you help me figure out what's wrong? If they're time material, that's usually where they're losing money, because they're using a price strategy that they adopted from the company they used to work for, or an employee told them about it, or they saw it online on the internet somewhere and started doing it. When you are charging time and material, you have to do a very good job of figuring out what to charge for all your parts, supplies, materials, throwaway items. You should have shop fees and fees for using your torch set. So when you braise something, there should be a fee, a torch fee for that. You use you pump down a system or recover refrigerant, of course, fees for that. You really have to have fees for everything imaginable, charge for everything you possibly can, because your invoice is going to be scrutinized much more carefully than it would be if it were presented as a flat rate price. So time material, I'm fine with it. Just to recap this, I'm fine with it. I mean, it has problems no matter what, but if you have to charge time material, that's fine as long as it's profitable. And, what's profitable? Well, you have to cover all of your costs. You have to be paid reasonably. You as an owner need to be paid more than I would pay you, right? I mean, if I were to hire you as a tech, you should be paid more than that if you're an owner, a lot more. Otherwise, why be an owner? Why not just work for somebody and put $1 away, $2 away every day and retire a multimillionaire? So you have to get paid well. So time material, got to charge enough that you're covering all your overhead, that you can afford decent stuff, decent equipment, decent trucks. You can pay yourself well, give yourself health insurance, dental, all your people, health insurance, dental insurance, all those things, and then produce a profit high enough that after the government, state and local, and all the others get their share, you have enough to grow on. So you probably want a 20% net profit before taxes. And who's getting that? Most people aren't. Most companies aren't getting that. Time material or flat rate, they're not getting it. But it's really difficult to make that kind of money when you're showing everybody an itemized invoice. I'll say one more thing about flat rating, and then I'll wrap it up. Imagine if I told you for now on, every time you do an install, you have to give them an itemized invoice. So, you handed them a sales proposal and said, I'll replace your whole system for $15,000. And they said, oh, well, okay, let's do it. And you replaced it, and you went to them with that proposal, and you said, hey, I'm done. Can I have my $15,000? And they pay you. But imagine I told you for now on, you have to give them a sheet that itemizes out everything you used and how much you charged them for it. Well, now you walk up to them and say, hey, I'm all done. You owe me $15,000. Here's your itemized invoice. They're going to look at that thing and they're going to be surprised, and they're going to question you, and they're going to debate you, and you're going to be surprised how difficult it is to get your $15,000 check and get out of there. Well, that's what we're doing with service all the time when we itemize the invoice. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about on inventory control, tonight, I'm hoping that some of you have gotten some new ideas on how to deal with inventory management. I'm working on an inventory management manual that I'll be anxious to share with everybody. I'm kind of on like version 1 of it, but it's getting pretty close to being finished. I'll let you guys know when I have it done, and hopefully I'll post something if you're on LinkedIn or Facebook. Hopefully you're one of my friends, and if you're not, go find me and hook up, because that's usually how I announce these things. Otherwise, you can contact me online and just say, hey, let me know when you get that thing ready. All right, hopefully I've given you some things to think about on inventory management. What I want to do in the following shows, we'll come back to this, is I want to either bring in a guest who has done a fantastic job of inventory control, and I have some in mind, and I'd hope to do that tonight. But I also would like to go to their facility at some point too in the future and show you around and tell you some of the things that I think they're doing that's extremely well, that I think you could do easily in your own company if you just saw it. All right, that's it. I appreciate everyone being here. Please subscribe to the channel. If you hit the subscribe button and hit the bell notification, you'll be notified when these shows are going to be on and when we go live. And also it helps us a lot, because the more people that subscribe and the more people that hit that notification bell, I've learned that Google really cares about that. And they look at you totally different. They look at us totally different when we have more people subscribing and more people hitting the notification bell. So it would really help us out if you would do that. I'd totally appreciate it. Again, I'm James Leichter for Field Service Live. Look forward to seeing you every Thursday, 7 p.m. Hope to see you next time. Thank you.